I do have from a long time ago, a previous commitment uh, from 3:30 to 4:30, but would require a little setup time, so probably like 3 to 4:30.
Okay.
If we aren't done, I just kind of always assumed that this probably would be done by then, but if it is not, it would be my intention to just step away, but I certainly will review all the recordings and everything and get up to speed on it, but that just is lingering. I just wanted to explain it in advance if we get to that time.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Weibel? Yeah, one thing, Judge, I wanted to just advise the court, we either have filed or will file this morning a motion for Brian so he can appear, or Mr. Doherty can appear tomorrow without local counsel making the drive to Linton.
It's been filed. I saw it this morning and I will grant it. And hopefully a paper order will go out today, but if not, I'm on the record saying it will be granted, so.
Thank you, Judge. I just wanted to let you know.
All right. Anything else? All right, Mr. Phillips, I think you have the first witness this morning.
Yes, good morning, Your Honor. And just to introduce myself, I am David Phillips, representing Burleigh County, filling in for Randy Bakke today. We call Bailey Elkins.
Ms. Elkins, can you hear me okay?
You're muted.
I can.
All right, now I can hear you. Great. I'll have you start by stating your full name for the record and spelling your last name.
Bailey Elkins, Elkins.
Ms. Elkins, before you testify this morning, I'm required by law to advise you on the penalties for perjury in the state of North Dakota. Perjury is a Class C felony, punishable by a maximum fine of $10,000, a maximum 5 years imprisonment, or both. Do you understand what perjury is?
Yes.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Your Honor. And just very briefly before I question, just to let the commissioners know, Ms. Elkins did previously testify in this matter as a member of the public on October 22nd, 2024, just about her concerns in relation to the pipeline near her home. She's going to testify today about additional issues relating to drinking water, source water, surface water, and slope issues, and clarify some issues that came up in her previous testimony. Ms. Elkins, can you state your name for the record?
Bailey Elkins.
And what is your occupation?
I currently work as a project manager with training as a geologist.
Can you tell the commissioners about your educational background, specifically relating to drinking water, source water, and surface water?
Certainly. I have a bachelor's of science in geoscience with coursework emphasis on geochemistry, hydrogeology, and geophysics.
And can you tell the commissioners your work history, again, with a particular emphasis on those water and slope issues?
I have worked as an environmental geologist in pipeline remediation and environmental dig permitting, as well as source water protection specialist for North Dakota Rural Water Systems Association for over 5 years as a source water protection specialist, working with communities to understand their drinking water sources and providing or helping them develop pragmatic solutions to protect their drinking water.
And in preparation for your testimony today, have you reviewed some documents that were provided by my office?
I have.
I'll just briefly read through the list of documents and just have you confirm at the end that you did receive and review those documents. Phase 1 Geohazards Assessment document dated January 30th, 2024, specifically at section 6. And for the record, that's docket 437-7. Pre-filed testimony of James Powell regarding geological instability. Again, it's page 6 along with exhibit C. That's docket 530 and also hearing exhibit SCSR 12. Letter from Edward Murphy to Victor Schock, dated March 3rd, 2023. That's docket 64. Letter from SCS Carbon Transport to North Dakota Geological Survey, dated March 31st, 2023. That's docket 165. Letter from Edward Murphy to Victor Schock, dated March 7th, 2024. That's docket 457. Portions of the SCS Carbon Transport's petition for reconsideration at docket 371. And the Bismarck route analysis by Summit Carbon Solutions filed with the PSC on January 24th, 2024, and that's at docket 432. Just confirming that you've received those documents and have reviewed them.
I have.
Have you seen anything in what you've reviewed to suggest that Summit indicates it'll follow best practices in relation to geohazard assessment to identify high hazard or landslide erosion areas?
I've seen some evidence that they've attempted to follow some best practices. However, not in their entirety.
Can you explain that last part, not in their entirety?
Specifically, that they have attempted to conduct field assessments, but have not engaged in field assessments of all identified slide areas or high slope areas.
Have you seen anything to suggest that Summit plans to account for crossing ephemeral or seasonal water features?
I have not.
Is it your experience that large precipitation or runoff events can contribute to significant erosion?
It is.
Have you seen anything to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, it's okay.
Have you seen anything to suggest that Summit plans to identify locations where civil or geotechnical mitigation measures are needed to minimize slope movement?
I've seen suggestions from Summit's consultant, but I haven't seen any indications that those suggestions would be implemented.
Have you seen anything to suggest that Summit plans to develop site-specific reclamation and revegetation strategies?
I have not.
These various issues that you just addressed, do they address and are related to environmental concerns as well as health and safety concerns related to the pipeline?
Environmental concerns, I would be concerned about significant erosion from the inadequate revegetation and the potential for a site rupture if too much soil were removed or were to expose that pipe.
Do you believe the PSC should impose requirements on Summit in that regard?
I do.
Let's talk a little bit about slope stability specifically. At the April 22nd hearing, did Mr. Pelham ask you some questions about slope stability in relation to the pipeline?
He did. He asked what my recommendation would be, which I'd suggested having field geologists review the route in person.
Actually going out to the site in person, right?
Correct.
Based on your review of the documents in this case, do you still have concerns about Summit not having sent field geologists out to the field?
I do have concerns. Only identified slopes have, or identified landslides have been visited in person. And even those that have been identified, Summit has said that they've only visited a subset of those. And while active landslides would pose a hazard, there's also the possibility that significant precipitations events, just like we saw east of Jamestown yesterday, or west of Jamestown, excuse me, could contribute to new slides. So that type of slope identification or lack of would be hazardous to the pipe.
Following the April 22nd hearing, did you conduct some further research to try to address Mr. Pelham's questions?
I did. I heard Mr. Pelham ask a representative from Summit what if that was industry best practices. So I identified several documents, one from a pipeline transmission company on their operating practices for how they handle construction and landslide mitigation, as well as an additional document put together by several larger pipeline operators in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy that identified best practices in high slope areas.
Thank you. And let's turn to those one at a time. I'm going to have you look at Exhibit BC 131. Just, Ms. Elkins, let me know when you have that up.
I do.
And is this one of the reports that you just mentioned a moment ago?
It is.
And is this document collaboration between various oil and gas pipeline companies and the Nature Conservancy?
It is.
Do you believe this report has some helpful information that the PSC should consider in relation to the Summit Pipeline?
I do.
Your Honor, I would move to introduce Exhibit BC 1.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Weibel?
We have no objection.
Mr. Pelham?
No objection.
All right, BC 131 is received.
And specifically, what aspect of this report do you think would be useful for the PSC in rendering a decision in this case?
I think the PSC would benefit from the pre-construction phase information provided in this report, as well as potential best practices and operation and maintenance best practices. That it would be helpful in ensuring that Summit is following the best practices identified by these oil and gas pipeline operators, considering that a rupture in their pipe could pose significant hazards to those of us who reside near the pipeline.
And does this report identify best practices specifically to improve steep slope pipeline construction?
It does.
And maybe just very briefly tell the commission generally what the report says about that.
So the report outlines best practices during construction, identifying hazard areas, water crossings, locations where additional measures would need to be taken place, and then site-specific activities when they are reclaiming that site or reburying that, as well as additional best practices during the construction phase of the pipeline and inciting the pipeline.
Have you seen anything to suggest that Summit has best practices in place to ensure optimal placement and installation of slope barriers?
I've seen some effort to avoid slope areas and be guided by the North Dakota Geological Survey, but I have not seen anything along the route beyond the guidance provided by the North Dakota Geological Survey. To my recollection.
Have you seen anything to suggest that Summit plans to follow best practices to optimize groundwater management during the construction?
I have not, beyond horizontal boring. But I do have concerns on how that could impact local water tables and especially local perched aquifers that serve as the sole drinking water source for more remote rural residents.
And do you believe the PSC should require Summit to follow best practices and address these concerns?
I do.
Does this report also address the operations and maintenance phase for the pipelines?
It does.
And does it describe best practices?
It does describe best practices.
Again, just generally describe for the commission what this report says about those best practices.
For the operations and maintenance phase, it identifies how often things should be reviewed, how often things should, and I have seen some information regarding that in Summit's application, but I have not seen everything identified, and I apologize. It's been a little while since I've read that. I don't think I can identify or briefly summarize for you.
In any
I
event,
was
based
more
on your
concerned on the hazard mitigation during construction and identifying the site.
based on your review of it, do you believe it'd be appropriate for the PSC to require Summit to follow those best practices?
Absolutely.
I'm going to have you now look at Exhibit BC 132.
I have it available.
Is this the other document you referred to earlier that you found in your research?
It is.
And is this a slope stability procedure document for the construction of an actual pipeline?
It is.
And it appears this was prepared by Dominion Transmission, Inc. Is that right?
That is correct.
What type of pipeline is covered by this document?
It is a natural gas pipeline.
Is there information in this policy and procedure that you believe would be helpful for the PSC to consider in this case?
I believe the PSC should consider the field reconnaissance portion of this pipeline, as well as some of the slope failure training policies that are laid out and slope failure mitigation practices, and to also consider what inspections have been required, as carbon dioxide leaks are more hazardous than natural gas.
Your Honor, I'd move to introduce Exhibit BC 132.
Any objection, Mr. Glut?
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
No objection.
All right, BC 132 is received.
Have you seen anything to suggest that Summit has prepared a similar policy and procedure in writing for the pipeline design, construction, and maintenance in this case?
I have seen some information regarding maintenance, but I have not seen anything for the construction phase of the project.
Do you believe it'd be advisable for Summit to go ahead and prepare that for that additional issue?
I do.
In your opinion, is the slope stability policy and procedure important?
I think the slope stability policies and construction procedures are very important. Potential slides could have significant impact on that. In fact, the pipeline regulatory agency, oh gosh, I'm going to say the acronym wrong and I apologize, a PHMSA, Pipeline Hazardous Materials Association. I'm sorry. But they've released a document several years back that I've referred to in my previous testimony to indicate how slope stability issues have had significant impacts on pipelines and the hazards that they prevent. The more stringent we can be in requiring these things, the more likely, or the more assured we, the public, can be that these practices will be followed and that the construction companies are following what has been proposed in the application.
What types of hazards do policies and procedures like this help prevent?
In my experience, even in water transmission lines, operators essentially shake their fists at the as-builts that things aren't necessarily done right. So providing or insisting on training and policies for how to handle certain areas like this would prevent any kind of passing of liability to the construction company, saying, well, we just didn't know better. and ensuring that everyone working on this pipeline is on the same page while they're building things, and also avoiding hazardous areas, even as they're identified in the field.
How would you define source water?
In the drinking water industry, source water is identified as the source of drinking water, so where water is supplied from.
And what is a source water protection area?
Source water protection areas are defined as an area that could, I'll back up. For groundwater, source water protection areas are defined as an area that could potentially have impact on a drinking water supply within about a 5-year period. It's generally modeled to identify the contribution area from the aquifer to the well. For communities and areas that provide or that are utilizing water, what we traditionally think of as water bodies, lakes, rivers, streams, as their drinking water supply, source water protection areas are generally indicated to be an entire watershed. However, for the state of North Dakota, that would make our entire state a source water protection area. So it has been limited in scope, where it extends a certain amount of river miles upstream and 1,000 feet beyond the high water mark of that water body.
Do you have any concerns about the potential impacts of the Summit pipeline on source water?
I do have some concerns if there were in fact any ruptures. CO2 has been considered a pollutant, and it's also heavier than air. I can foresee it impacting those water bodies, and also potentially, in the event of like a Missouri River crossing, water treatment plants in the Missouri River Valley.
Are there any statutes in North Dakota that contain regulations or rules relating to the operation of water resource districts?
There are.
Have you looked at those before your testimony today?
I have reviewed them.
Does Burleigh County, to your understanding, have a water resource district?
They do.
And is it your understanding Burleigh County is bound by state statutes in relation to the operation of the Burleigh County Water Resource District?
Yes.
And just to be clear, are those statutes found in chapter 61-16.1 of the North Dakota Century Code?
Correct.
Based on your understanding of the law, does the Water Resource Board have the power and authority to make rules and regulations concerning the management, control, regulation, and conservation of waters, and prevent the pollution, contamination, and other misuse of water resources, streams, or bodies of water included within the district?
I believe that is the language. So yes.
Is it your understanding that supercritical CO2 in large concentrations is a pollutant?
Yes.
Is it your understanding that Burleigh County Water Resource District has the power and authority to make rules and regulations concerning the management, control, regulation, and conservation of waters to prevent pollution, contamination, or other misuses of water?
It is.
From your work with the North Dakota Rural Water Systems Association and otherwise, are you familiar with the city of Bismarck and where they get the water sources from?
Missouri River is the water supply for the city of Bismarck.
On the area where the Summit Pipeline reroute is proposed, the areas, are there nearby pipelines that provide water to the city of Bismarck or other municipalities in Burleigh County?
I believe the South Central Water Treatment Plant is a little over 2.5 miles south of the proposed pipeline crossing, which provides water to the city of Wilton, numerous rural developments and homeowners associations, portions of North Bismarck, and I believe also extending out towards municipalities near the city of Wayne, or not municipalities, but homes.
Ms. Elkins, I'm going to have you look at BC 107, which was previously admitted into evidence in this case.
Okay. I have it.
And what does this image depict?
This image depicts the pipeline proposed route in crossing the Missouri River. And there's also called out the South Central Regional Water District's water treatment plant and water intake.
Do you know where the pipelines go from the South Central Regional Water District?
I have a general understanding of where the pipelines go. However, I have not seen a distribution map beyond visiting their office and seeing things on the walls in the past.
Have you tried?
I'd reached out to people that I had worked with previously in my position as the source water protection specialist for North Dakota Water Systems Association, asking if they'd potentially be willing to share that map with me. And initially I was told that they would. However, upon further follow-up, I was told that that information would not be provided to me, that there was concerns about potential political ramifications of allowing that to be shared with the Public Service Commission for this hearing.
What are the potential adverse consequences of a CO2 leak into the water supply or the drinking water in Burleigh County?
The initial concern that I would have for a CO2 leak would be incapacitating people near or at the water treatment plant that operate that, followed by CO2 dissolves in the water, displacing dissolved oxygen, which makes that water not potentially unfit for aquatic life, as well as altering the pH, which could impact how the water is treated by that plant, assuming that there were no catastrophic issues for those operating it.
How deep is the South Central Regional Water District pipeline buried below the ground?
Best practices in the state of North Dakota are to bury the pipelines around 8 feet deep to avoid freeze-up. The South Central Regional Water District pipes are generally buried from about 7.5 to 8 feet.
Is it your understanding the Summit pipeline is proposed to be a maximum of about 4 feet deep in this case?
It is.
Do you have any concerns about that?
I have some major concerns that they will be crossing a number of water mains as well as service lines that are providing water to different residences. In the event of a break, of which my experience in the water industry has indicated are frequent due to frost heaving and other ground movement issues. If that break were to occur near Summit's pipe, I think that it would cause significant additional burden to those operating that water supply to have to work around the pipeline or whatever best practices are going to be. I did not research what the best practices are for excavating near a CO2 pipeline, but I imagine it would involve something like a hydrovacuum and potentially shutting down of the pipeline. And as a ratepayer for the water systems, I can only imagine how that's going to increase the cost beyond just bringing out a backhoe and digging up a leak. there would be significantly more coordination. Those of us that would be impacted would be without water for much longer. And as I said, it would drive up costs for those of us who are members of the water system for having to pay for these procedures to work around the pipeline that wasn't there when the rural water lines were put in.
Have you reviewed maps of the location of the proposed pipeline?
I have.
And are you generally aware of where the proposed pipeline on the north side is installed or proposed to be installed in relation to this, to Baldwin?
I am. Didn't really, okay.
Do you have any concerns about that?
In relation to Baldwin, I think that it is remarkably close to the community, less than 1 mile away from the community, and that it will be crossing the South Central lines many times.
Do you have any concerns if the route was moved further south, you get further from Baldwin?
If it was moved further south from Baldwin, I believe it would be impacting some of the other neighbors in many more densely populated areas, such as the ranch, and I believe it's already been rerouted further north due to concerns about proximity to the city of Bismarck.
And just to wrap things up here, are you familiar with the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act?
I am.
Based on your education, experience, and understanding, what effect does the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act have on the Summit Pipeline proposal?
The Safe Drinking Water Act controls injection wells. I believe that it would definitely impact how they would be handling those things, but also acting as a potential pollutant that's going to have to be addressed on concerns mitigated to protect the city's water supply. As part of it, it will require additional work by the person who's taken over my position as the source water protection specialist for North Dakota Rural Water Systems Association, as well as additional revisions to those source water protection plans for the city of Mandan, South Central Regional Water District, and others. And there will be additional burden on state employees to assist in the drafting of that.
Thank you, Ms. Elkins. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Mr. Gillette, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor, just briefly. Good morning, Ms. Elkins.
Good morning.
I may have missed it. Did you say you reviewed Summit's environmental construction plan, which was filed at docket 1 in anticipation of your testimony?
Briefly, but that was some time ago, not in preparation for my testimony.
When you did look at it, did you review Summit's plans for, within that plan, Summit has set forth plans for stabilization, reclamation and vegetation, water management, and various crossing methods. Did you look at those?
I do not recall. As I said, it was some time ago, months.
Have you reviewed Summit's proposed pipeline in comparison or with respect to the commission's avoidance and exclusion areas?
Could you reference the document name, please?
Maybe I'll rephrase that. Do you know what the commission's avoidance and exclusion areas are?
I understand some of the avoidance areas. I don't think I could recite them to you.
Okay. One more question, Ms. Elkins. Are you aware that Summit's going to bore the pipeline 49 feet below the Missouri riverbed?
I am aware that the Missouri riverbed will be bored 49 feet below, and I also have concerns about scouring and reworking of that sand in the event of flooding.
Thank you, Ms. Elkins. I have no further questions.
Mr. Pelham, any questions?
I have a few. Good morning, Ms. Elkins. Sorry you're not able to be here in person. Hope your recovery is going okay. You mentioned a couple times in your testimony this morning the North Dakota Rural Water Association. Are you employed by them?
I was previously employed by them as the source water protection specialist.
Okay. And just to be clear, you're testifying in your individual capacity, not for any employer, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
I am no longer employed with them. I am testifying as an individual.
Understood. And that's what I thought. I just wanted to confirm that. Mr. Phillips asked you a little bit about the location of the proposed route in and around Baldwin. And he asked if you had concerns if the route was moved south, and you answered that question. Do you have concerns if the proposed route were moved north?
I believe that the route would have to be significantly further north, as moving several miles north of Baldwin would place the route within the wind farm that is north of Bismarck. With significant transmission lines and I'm assuming underground lines, but I'm not as familiar with electricity gathering.
Fair enough. Early on in your testimony this morning, ma'am, you were asked about whether or not Summit had done field assessments as to the potential for sliding subsidence, geological issues with where the route is currently proposed to be. Do you have any specific areas along the proposed route that you believe that, excuse me, these additional field assessments should be done?
I believe that higher slope areas should be receiving this field reconnaissance, not only to identify existing slides, but potential future slides.
Understood. And in your review of the materials that you cited, you reviewed, where are these higher slope areas specifically?
I've reviewed the portions of the reroute, as that is what's going to most likely impact me. As I've said in my previous testimony, it is difficult to place Summit's pipe with the way that their map book is set up, and no shape files have been provided. But specifically west of Highway 83 between the Missouri River and there, and I know that there's significant topography within Emmons County as well as the North Bismarck area.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Elkins. I don't have any other questions for you this morning.
Mr. Leibel or Mr. Jordy, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. I do have some questions, Ms. Elkins. You had discussed relative to the geohazard questions, field assessments. Are field assessments also part and parcel of what's known as phase 2 assessments or phase 2 surveys? Are you familiar with the difference between a phase 1 and a phase 2 survey?
Are you talking about like environmental phase 1 and phase 2 assessments? Maybe I'm not familiar.
Yeah, in terms of, like phase 1, for instance, like a desktop identifying literature, something you can do in the comfort of your office or home, and then phase 2 actually getting out there in the field with in-person geologists. Is that something that kind of rings a bell to you?
Yes.
All right, and it was your recommendation that the in-person field geologist type of the next step analysis should take place.
Correct.
Are you aware that it's hypothesized that the Satarsha, Mississippi incident was at least caused in part by significant precipitation events that affected and made the soil unstable?
I am aware.
And those are the kind of concerns you have for the sensitive areas that have not yet had field geologist assessments in North Dakota. Is that right?
That is correct.
You mentioned shape files. How does a shape file, what type of data is embedded within a shape file that would assist in analysis and could help further your opinions along?
A shapefile is meant to be incorporated into what we call GIS. So it's a map or a map-based system that allows people to place that particular shape into or onto other maps. Being able to have that specific coordinates and locations of the pipeline would allow people to more easily conduct analysis to identify proximity from different features, as well as overlaying it on different types of soils that it's crossing and reviewing topography. Something as simple as putting it on top of a topographic map.
And having those shape files would be helpful and greatly aid that type of analysis, correct?
Correct.
As a geologist, have you become aware of testimony in Iowa relative to the Summit proposed pipeline that there's geology in Iowa sufficient to store the CO2 that Summit seeks to store in western North Dakota?
Objection, Your Honor,
heard
relevance.
of-
Hang on.
Objection, relevance.
I think we've had others testify about this. I'll allow you to ask limited questions, but I don't want to get too deep into anything pertinent to Iowa, Mr. Yordi.
Well, no, I appreciate that. This is all pertinent to North Dakota since this doesn't have to happen in North Dakota since it's available in Iowa. That's all I'm establishing. So you're aware of that testimony?
I've heard of potential sequestration sites closer to the bulk of the Iowa Iowa area plants.
And as a geologist, based on your training, education, experience, and background, and based on your concerns for the geohazards and other drinking water related hazards in North Dakota, would it be your opinion that if there's sufficient geology in Iowa to store the proposed carbon dioxide Summit intends to transport, that it would be prudent to investigate that more prior to routing 350 miles across North Dakota to store it?
I believe it would be prudent to sequester the CO2 as close to the source as possible to minimize any risks in transmission.
All right, and you understand there's exactly one source point of CO2 proposed in North Dakota that would be part of this proposed Summit hazardous pipeline, correct?
I do.
All right, thank you. I don't have anything further.
Commissioner Chrisman?
Have you read any of the citing certificate approval orders from the PSC for other pipelines like Dakota Access or any of the other major pipelines in North Dakota from somewhat recent years? I'm not talking about in the 70s.
I believe I've read the Dakota Access when there was significant political upheaval in the area regarding that. However, that was quite a long time ago. And this is a very different product.
And so there was that order, and then there was also the certification attached to it. Do you recall that?
I do not.
Okay, I guess my next question was whether you feel that between our orders and the attached certifications, whether they cover a lot of the things that you're talking about. But if you haven't reviewed one, recently. I guess no point asking that. I just also want to touch on one thing that your attorney said. Hopefully it was just a slip of the tongue. But do you recall when Mr. Phillips mentioned this being buried at a maximum 4-foot depth?
I heard that on average or approximately 4 feet, but as
I just wanted to clarify, because a maximum of 4 feet implies that in most cases it would be less than 4 feet, and the 4 feet is a minimum, not a maximum. Is that your understanding as well?
That had been my understanding as well, that it would be deeper for borings.
Okay, thank you. No other questions. Thanks for being here.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
Good morning. Just a clarification, I didn't write down all the documents that you reviewed, but have you reviewed agency documents as far as in reference to landslides?
By agency, are you referring to the Public Service Commission?
Or like SHPO? In any of those, any agency responses?
I have not done, no.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
No questions. Thank you for appearing today.
Any redirect, Mr. Phillips?
Very briefly, Your Honor. And I will clarify that was my mistake and my slip of the tongue, Commissioner. Just very briefly, Ms. Elkins, when Mr. Glutt was questioning you about boring under the river, you'd mentioned you do have some concerns about scouring and reworking of sand, if I heard your testimony correctly. Can you just briefly tell the commission what those concerns are?
My concern is in that higher precipitation events or another potential event akin to when the floodgates were open for Garrison Dam, or even releases of ice dams, that water has tremendous power that is able to move the river channel, that scouring would potentially lower the depth of burial, if you would, so that it's more likely to be impacted by debris flow or other issues to the pipe. I also have concerns regarding slides on the riverbanks in such an event that the river could cause additional erosion that may impact that horizontal drilling.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Glutt, any other questions?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Jordy?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Any other commissioner questions? Mr. Dawson? All right, thank you, Ms. Elkins.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I think next witness is yours, Mr. Jordy.
I sure hope so. If John Hagerot is available to take the stand, I call John.
Did you hear that, Mr. Jordy?
I did not.
Mr. Hagerod is saying that his sister, is it Janelle? would like to
Janelle
testify?
Olson. Oh, perfect. Yep, Janelle would be great.
Good morning. First thing I'm going to ask you to turn that microphone on. The gray button, yep.
There?
Yes.
Is that on?
Yep.
Okay.
If you state your full name for the record and if you want to spell your last name.
Janelle Olson, O-L-S-O-N.
And Ms. Olson, were you in the room this morning when I went through the penalties for perjury?
I was.
And do you understand what perjury is?
I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Jordy.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Olson. I noticed that you have some papers in front of you. My first question is, have you testified either live or with pre-filed testimony prior to today?
I have not.
All right. And did you prepare some thoughts so that we could get through this quicker and you could be more organized with what important information you'd like to share with the commission?
Yes, I've just prepared a statement.
All right. Would you like to make that statement now?
I would.
Okay, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Janelle Hagerat Olson. I'm a fourth generation farmer and rancher, and the proposed Summit pipeline crosses our land. One of Plato's most famous quotes is that silence gives consent. This quote reflects his belief that failing to speak out against injustice is tantamount to condoning it, and I cannot be silent. I'm here today because I am deeply concerned about the safety of this pipeline and the integrity of Summit Carbon Solutions. I'd like to start by showing you two pictures. This picture is my three beautiful girls, Brianna, Courtney, and Alyssa Olson. And this second picture is of my daughter, Brianna, and my granddaughter, Hadley. My daughter, Brianna, is expecting and is due with her second baby this month. As a mother and a grandmother, I've had many worries over the years, but by far my greatest concern has always been their health and safety. The proposed pipeline is about 3/4 of a mile from the home that I grew up in, where my husband and I built our home and have farmed and ranched for 32 years, and where someday my hope is that my daughters will build their homes. I show you these pictures today again because I want you to not only see my precious girls' faces, I want you to remember them. Sadly, in the United States, we've had many tragedies. 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing, Sandy Hook, and so many others. Oh, and let's not forget about the rupture of the carbon pipeline in Satarsha, Mississippi in 2020, where toxic carbon dioxide spewed into the air for about 4 hours and sent people to the hospital and hundreds to be evacuated. The sad thing is, when tragedies like these happen, maybe, just maybe, the names or the pictures of the victims will flash across a newsreel or a memorial wall will be set up, but days and weeks go by and everyone forgets. That's everyone who's not directly affected. For those who lost loved ones, have longstanding health effects, witnessed the horror or tried to provide life-saving treatment, their lives will never be the same. I show you those pictures because I want you to remember their faces when there's a problem with this proposed pipeline. I can only pray that it doesn't kill them or cause longstanding health problems. I say when, because it is not a question is if there is a leak or an explosion, it's when. Just last month, there was another CO2 leak at the Lake Charles pump station in Sulphur, Louisiana. It's a fact, pipelines break and leak, whether this is an oil, water, or CO2 pipeline. These pipelines are subject to degradation due to many factors, including thermal expansion, contraction, and mechanical forces. Although it's a known fact that pipelines leak and break, there are way too many unknowns and no possible way to predict the consequences with this proposed pipeline. How will the extreme temperature changes in North Dakota affect the integrity of the pipeline and its components? Where will this leak or break occur? How far and what direction will the gas travel, especially in the setting of the extreme wind we have here in North Dakota? How many people will die? How many will suffer longstanding physical and mental health problems as a direct result? How dare you, Summit Carbon Solutions, put the lives of my girls, my grandchildren, and the people of North Dakota at risk? Furthermore, how dare you businessmen, the politicians with their own agendas who support this project in the name of greed, put the lives of North Dakotans at risk? How dare you? I am beyond blessed to have my children live close by, and nearly every weekend we spend a day together. If this proposed pipeline is allowed to be constructed, I'll need to live in constant fear that if my children and grandchildren come to visit, their lives could be in jeopardy because of the proximity of this pipeline to our home. Furthermore, how can I encourage them to someday build a home and continue the legacy of our family farm, knowing that they face such significant risk? In addition to farming and ranching with my father, my brother, and my husband, I have worked in healthcare for 30 years. First as a CNA, then as a registered nurse, and finally as a nurse practitioner. I have devoted a large part of my life to the health and well-being of the patients I serve. I worry about the health and safety of my patients and all those who live here in North Dakota. Exposure to carbon dioxide has many health effects. Depending on the concentration and the length of exposure, CO2 can cause convulsions, coma, and death. Thankfully, in our area, we have never experienced a major CO2 event. However, I've seen many patients whose level of CO2 in their body has risen to dangerous levels. This is treated by shoving a tube down their throat to provide mechanical ventilation when they can't breathe on their own. Obviously, this is not a natural process. Patients will try to fight this. They'll try to rip out the tube. They'll have to be restrained and sedated. For those who've had to witness this in patients they care for or in people they love, it creates emotions and memories that'll never be forgotten. I will never, ever forget seeing my mom on a ventilator. My mom, who was adamantly opposed to this pipeline, who died on my birthday on July 6, 2022. I ask you, Summit Carbon Solutions, and you, the commissioners, are you prepared to see North Dakotans or those that you love on a ventilator due to toxic CO2 exposure if the Summit pipeline were to leak or to explode? That will only occur if your loved one is fortunate enough to survive the explosion and the emergency personnel are able to get to them. Are our firefighters, paramedics, and other EMS personnel trained and able to respond to a potential mass casualty event? Are our hospitals equipped to manage and treat this type of emergency? You know, there's only so many ventilators available. The pipeline runs near Bismarck, one of North Dakota's most populous cities. The hospitals in North Dakota are running at capacity or near capacity every single day. Patients wait hours to be seen and treated in the emergency room. Many patients are held in hallways on temporary gurneys, waiting for a room in the hospital. Sometimes this is hours, sometimes it's days. Frequently, our hospitals are on diversion. That means they have absolutely no room to take another patient. If our community is faced with a CO2 leak or explosion, what happens to your loved ones then? Are they just left to die? Summit has met with some emergency responders and say they have plans to do more training in the future. Does Summit have a plan for the fact that our hospitals are at capacity and do not have the room or the staff to care for an emergency like this? Perhaps they do. Get more body bags. As I mentioned, I'm the fourth generation on our family farm. My great-grandfather, Edward Hagerott, homesteaded here in 1883. For 141 years, our family has worked tirelessly to preserve and maintain the integrity of our land. We have planted hundreds, if not thousands, of trees and modified farming practices to include no-till farming, all in the name of preserving the land that's sacred to us. This is with the hope that someday our children can carry on our legacy. Never in my mind, or I'm sure the mind of my ancestors, would we intentionally do something that has the potential to cause harm to our animals, our property, and our neighbors. But that's exactly what Summit Carbon Solutions is planning. They're taking the garbage, the waste from ethanol plants and piping it across several states, disrupting often untouched land and dumping it in our sacred ground, putting all of us in danger in the process. Why in the world would anyone think that this is acceptable? I think we all know why. It's money, it's greed, and it's politics. I'd like to give you an analogy. On our ranch, we have a feedlot. This needs to be cleaned of hay, straw, and manure. This is our waste product. Let's say I was to arrange to have our waste hauled load after load, hour after hour, day after day, and year after year to the yards of you, the public commissioners, or to the summit executives, or the politicians who think this carbon pipeline is a good idea. You, and I'm sure your neighbors, certainly wouldn't enjoy the sight or the smell of the manure. Our waste piling up in your yard. This analogy is like allowing Summit to pipe their waste through and into our land. There's one key difference though. Our waste might look and smell bad, but it won't kill you. Finally, I'd like to speak to my concerns about the integrity of Summit Carbon Solutions. Summit claims, and I quote, "We remain committed to pursuing good faith negotiation with landowners." As of today, I'd have absolutely no recollection of one single in-person visit, phone call, text, email, or letter from Summit to myself. The only contact I've had with Summit has been indirect. When we initially found people walking on our land without permission, we asked who they were and why we were there. We were told they were surveyors from Summit. We asked them to leave. Fast forward quite some time, and I got a phone call, mind you, while I was at work trying to care for patients. This phone call came from my husband and my brother. They informed me that the Summit entourage had shown up at our farm with several vehicles and multiple people. When my brother stopped them, they told him that they had permission based on a court ruling. However, due to Summit's extreme inattention to detail, these surveyors were oblivious to the fact that our property was not in fact included in this court ruling. The next contact I had with Summit, again indirectly, was when I was served papers to appear in court to grant Summit's request to survey our property. An acquaintance of my husband and mine is a landman, and he works obtaining easements for multiple companies. For a while, he worked for Summit. This acquaintance told us he'd be able to secure a crazy high dollar offer for an easement on our property. When I said we weren't interested, I was told by him that this project is too big, too powerful, and it will go through. And when that happens, you'll get nothing because eminent domain will be used. Summit's commitment to good faith negotiations is to bully landowners into signing easements. These examples exemplify Summit's complete lack of vigilance for attention to detail. A company that's putting the health and safety of North Dakotans at risk should be meticulous, and that certainly has not been demonstrated by Summit. It is known that Summit had private meetings, which included Chad Wachter, a developer. So Summit can meet with a developer, but can't meet with me, a landowner? At this meeting, dispersion model details were discussed, but this information has not been released to the public. Why? Summit says this is because of security reasons, but we all know the real reason. They don't want the public to know the real danger we're facing. Summit has repeatedly put dollar signs in front of safety and landowner rights. In conclusion, I'm begging you, the Public Service Commission, to deny Summit's Carbon Solutions request. Remember these beautiful faces and all of the residents of North Dakota. Don't let money and political agendas take precedence over their safety. Don't let them be the next tragedy that's too quickly forgotten.
Ms. Olson, thank you for that. And would you like to have those photographs made a part of the official record?
Yes.
Okay, we can get working on that. In the meantime, I have a few follow-up questions for you. You had mentioned your intention and that of your family to continue to be able to develop the land into the future and including future residences. Would you instead decide not to do that type of development if this hazardous pipeline is located on your land?
You know, my middle daughter, Courtney, has the same dream that I had growing up, and that was to continue our family farm. She and I talked about this yesterday, and I told her, I said, Courtney, I don't know. I don't know what I want you to do, because I don't know if it's safe for you to build here. And that's not fair. It's not fair for Summit to take that away from us.
And if the pipeline was located and affected your future development such that you didn't do that, would you agree that would have a negative economic impact and wouldn't be in your best general welfare?
Absolutely.
Now, you had mentioned being threatened by a Summit agent with eminent domain and feeling bullied and told that you might as well get on board or you'll get nothing. Do you have any idea how many other people went through that same process and ended up signing quote unquote alleged voluntary easements based on bullying and threatening tactics?
I am not aware of how many specifically felt. I can't speak to the feelings that they had, but I know that this tactic has been used. Even when they came to survey, my neighbors had a very, I don't know the word, very unpleasant contact with the surveyors at that time.
Do you understand that in preparation for these proceedings in May, approximately on May 21st, and then again yesterday in some testimony by Mr. Bayshans for Summit, they expressed to the PSC how willing they are to work with you and how willing they are to have conversations. How does that feel after 2 years of being through all of this?
Like I said, I've had no direct contact with anyone from Summit. If they were concerned about me as a landowner and the concerns that I have, they certainly could have reached out to me, and they have failed to do so.
Ma'am, because we weren't hearing anything from them, do you recollect that on behalf of APH Farms, myself, Mr. Liable, along with you and your brother, prepared a letter and kind of some potential least worst options if this was to be approved? Do you recall that in the April timeframe?
I do not. I was not directly involved in that.
Okay, so questions to that would be, that was the portion of the testimony that your brother John can handle. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, I think I'll ask him about the maps and that communication. Is there anything else that you'd like the commission to know to consider their decision on whether to approve or deny these applications before I turn you over for cross-examination?
No, I think I've said what I wanted to say.
All right, thank you very much, ma'am. Some others may have questions for you.
Mr. Glut, any questions?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Olson. I'm just wondering, and if your brother is better to testify, just tell me, but can you give the legal description of the property we're talking about?
I cannot give that legal description.
And it's your testimony, and I believe it's your testimony that the proposed line does cross property owned by this APH Farms. Is that right?
Correct.
And is that a LLC or a family partnership? What is
So
that?
I am part of a life estate on that property. It is owned by my father, Arden Habrad, and my brother Jonathan and I are included in that life estate. So
Understood. Fair enough. And you testified, ma'am, that you spoke with a landman from Summit. Is that right?
so yes. He worked for various companies. He did a lot of work with oil lines and stuff like that in the oil field. But this past year, he did some work for Summit. He spoke to me directly and over the phone about a potential offer. But that was not anything directly, I believe, directed by Summit.
So this landman, he's an acquaintance of yours?
Yes.
Or? Okay. Did he say that he worked for Summit?
Yes.
So he's working for Summit and he's contacting you directly related to this property that you have a life estate interest in and proposing something to you?
He said he would be able to work with Summit to arrange something. Yes.
And when was this?
I don't recall exactly, but it would have been late last summer, early fall.
And how many conversations did you have with this individual?
One around a campfire and one by phone.
Fair enough. And where was the conversation left?
That I was not interested.
No other follow-up from any agents, representatives of Summit after that?
None.
That you had? But you heard Mr. Jordy ask you about a letter that was sent. There was presumably further. You don't know anything about that?
I've had no contact, no.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Olson. I don't have any other questions.
Mr. Phillips, any questions?
No questions, Your Honor.
Commissioner Chrisman?
My only one is, so as I understand the life estate between you, your brother, and your father, when you say, other than the landman conversations with you, my understanding is you said that no one has contacted you. Are you speaking on behalf of your brother and father as well?
I'm speaking on behalf of myself.
Do you know whether there was contact or efforts to acquire easements with either your
Yes,
brother
they
or
have had contact with my brother and my 84-year-old father who doesn't see or hear well and has his own health problems. So probably not the best person to speak to in that regard.
But they did talk to your brother?
They have.
But not you. Okay.
I don't know if they've talked to them personally. I know he's received communications.
Okay. Thank you for being here, Jen.
Yes.
Commissioner Haugenhofer?
Thank you. Janelle, I just need clarification on something. You earlier testified that you've had no direct contact from Summit, and then you go through and you describe this landman from Summit as an acquaintance, and that worked with Summit to arrange something. So to me, that seems like there was direct contact.
Yeah,
so can you just clarify that for
so
me?
this is a guy that we, where we camp, and he comes down around the fire and we might sit around and have some drinks or visit or do things like that. And in that process is where this came up. And that he worked, I think, just briefly for Summit during that short time. And there was one phone call to me. We had talked about it down around the fire. And in that capacity, he had said that he could potentially work with Summit to try to get us this easement amount.
So would you say that was a direct contact?
No.
Okay.
In my mind, it is not direct because at that time, I don't even know how official his capacity was with working with them at that point.
Okay,
I don't know.
okay. Thanks for the clarification. I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Jordy, any redirect?
Well, I guess I am also a little puzzled, ma'am, and I appreciate you trying to be very precise with this contact. Obviously, this gentleman didn't show you any employment contract, but from the way he was talking and speaking, was it your impression that he was in communication with or somehow working with Summit at the time he made those overtures to you?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have anything further. Thank you.
Mr. Glut, any other questions?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
Nothing, thank you.
Mr. Phillips?
Nothing, Your Honor.
Any other commissioner question? Commissioner Hogan-Hoffert?
Sorry, I did have one more. You indicated, and I wrote down, bullied and threatened.
Mhm.
Can you describe what you mean by threatened?
Threatened by, if you're not going to consent to the easement, then you're going to get nothing if this, nothing for compensation if this were to go through on eminent domain.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. No further questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Olson, for your testimony. Mr. Jordy, next witness?
Yep, and just for the record, once we have copies of those photographs, we'll mark those and I'll offer them, but we'll keep moving. I call John Hagerat, please.
Also, to answer Mr. Pelham's question about the legal description, it is in Morton County, Township 140 North, Range 83 West, Section 10, the east half, Section 11, the west half.
All right, Mr. Hagerod, I'll have you start by stating your full name for the record.
Yes, my name is Jonathan Hagerott. That's last name is spelled Hagerott.
And is your first name
Jonathan.
Jon?
Jonathan.
All right, thank you.
I generally go by John, Jon, just to be less formal.
All right, Mr. Hagerott, were you in the room this morning when I went through the penalties for perjury?
I was.
And do you understand what perjury is?
I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Jordy.
Yes, John, good morning. Thank you for being here. My question, I notice you have various items and documents in front of you. First, I would just like you to identify each one kind of as a roadmap for what we're going to discuss, and then we can get into them.
Okay, I have a package of pictures of things I would like to show. I have my personal notes for my presentation here and my testimony here. I have a stack of letters that I received from Summit. And I have a similar package of letters that my father and mother received from Summit regarding our land in Morton County.
Very good. Now, with the blue folder, the photos, maybe does it make sense for you to kind of talk through those? And John, do you have enough that Mr. Lible can help you pass those around and get that marked as an exhibit?
I made 4 copies, one for our attorney and one for each of the commissioners is what I intended. I didn't realize there would be a room with this many, so if you would like to have those.
And we can get copies made for you. And John, I think you're gonna wanna keep one of those folders. Oh, you got it, great.
I do have my copy.
So why those are being passed around, and I'm sure Mr. Lible on a break or can get copies made. Can you generally explain why those photographs are important? What do you think the commission needs to understand relative to those photos?
These are photos of our property and other documents within there that well, I'll explain later that relate to things we've experienced with Summit, and also things that my mother experienced with Summit. And this process are in that package.
Mr. Hagerat, will you pull the mic a little bit closer
I'm
to
sorry.
you? No, you're fine.
I am.
You're just quiet.
Well, I will state that I am not a public speaker. I get very nervous and apprehensive about public speaking. This process has made me extremely nervous. I was unable to sleep last night, so if my eyes are a little blurry and I'm a little incoherent, I apologize. I will do my best to get through this. But now I've lost my track. Where did we leave off?
No, you're just fine. You're just fine. And so, okay, so we talked about the blue folder, and sir, I don't want to throw you off. If you have a logical sequence that you think makes the most sense, which item of information would you like to go through first?
Well, I do have sort of an order on my notes. I have a few pages of notes that are just the ticklers to help me remember what I want to talk about. I did not prepare a written statement. I do not have time for that in my life to work that up. Like my sister said, I am the 4th generation farming and ranching. My great-grandfather homesteaded 1883. I'm not going to rehash all that history. But we continue to farm that same ground. We do rent where my great-grandfather actually homesteaded. And a little background on myself personally. Yeah, I grew up there. I've got a bachelor's degree in civil engineering with an emphasis in structural design. I've worked for years as a structural engineer and a civil engineer. I'm licensed and I've got 14 state, well, I'm licensed, I have 14 state licenses in 13 individual states. I encompass the entire West Coast for high seismic, California, Oregon, and Washington. I farm with my dad and my sister and my brother-in-law. It's farm and cattle. During the prior hearings, I could not attend these earlier hearings. With cattle calving going on, I wake up at 1 in the morning and I'm out with the cows pretty much all night. Working 14, 15, 16, 18-hour days. Right now, I've been planting our crops, frantically trying to get that done. Again, long days. So trying to prepare a written statement, I just do not have time for that. So I've got just general note talking points here. And I'm going to launch into the first, my first bullet point, which is my personal experience with our land and utilities that run over that land. When I was about 7 years old, my parents bought me a Mini 50 motorcycle, which gave me a lot of freedom. And we have quite a sizable land holding. And I would disappear for hours on end as a little 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old on up, riding that little motorcycle through our property. And so I know that property quite well from the beginning of my earliest days. And we have numerous, well, we have 3 power lines that cross our land, high voltage power lines. We have an oil pipeline that runs across our land. We have rural water pipeline that runs across our land. And they all present problems for us. I'm going to start with the oil pipeline. That's the photo for page 1. And you can see that this pipeline, I don't know if you can see that, that's the condition the pipeline maintains their markings. This is on the road, adjacent to the road, about I don't know if it's even a half a mile north of our farmyard. It's in total disrepair. If you go to photo 2, or page 2, I want to talk about the utility markings that they do. Every so often, they walk our property as part of some sort of inspection process, and they will put down those little flags. This one happens to be orange. I just took a picture of it just to highlight it. I think theirs are yellow in color. And that crisscrosses several of our fields. While I was out planting the first year after they did this, I had to stop our four-wheel drive tractor and the big air seeder behind it, hop out and pick these up. And every so often I would see one as I was driving. I didn't know they were there beforehand. I haven't found all of them yet because I still find them. And they're a real hazard for us because that ground that year I planted oats hay. We cut that hay, we rake it up, it gets into bales. And some of those bales we actually grind up in a processor that we feed to our cattle. And if these bits of metal get in there and the cows eat that, they can die from that. So I'm real cognizant to find these, and I'm still finding them. Another item I want to talk, and I don't have pictures of it. On the property that we rent, which was my great-grandfather's original homesteading land, in about 2016 or 2017, we planted a new field of alfalfa. The following year, when that alfalfa was just coming up, when I happened to drive down past that field, here they had the oil pipeline, without any announcement, had shown up and dug a massive hole in that field in what appeared to have no protections for the topsoil to scrape that off first. It was just a big hole with a big pile of dirt, and they exposed probably about a 30-foot long piece of the pipe that they did a repair on. And later they pushed that soil back in and covered it up, and they didn't do anything that I'm aware of to reseed it or anything. And then to gain access to that area, they drove in from the approach quite a distance away from the pipe and tracked that fresh new, brand new alfalfa flat and did quite a bit of damage. My father did receive a small payment from them, but it did not cover the loss of production for all the years since in that area. Another thing that came up with that oil pipeline that I'm worried about with this future pipeline is what impact it'll have on us in the future with our use of that land or whoever would own it after us. And this example, I want to say it was about, again, 3-4 years ago, we had a very dry spring. And we have a small pasture about 3/4 of a mile north of our house. Excuse me. And that pasture we use after our cattle calve for a period of time until the calves get larger and we can move them to the next pasture. Well, that year with the dry weather conditions, the stock pond had almost no water in it, and it was actually a very foul-looking green color. So we fenced that off, and we drug a water tank up to that pasture, and we would truck water up there every day, 2 times a day. We would fill it and go up and let water run into that tank. There was freezing weather, so we were having all kinds of trouble with the valves on the tank freezing. It was a major hassle. That same time, the state of North Dakota Water Commission had a program for cost share on extending water lines for this emergency purpose. I filled out the paperwork, got approved. I contacted a local plumbing contractor. He gave me a quote of $6,000, and the cost share would have covered half of that. My mom, who controlled all the finances, says, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. She didn't want to. She thought it was fine that we haul the water, but we did the work, not her. So we had everything good to go. Well, the One Call Utilities called, and there was a windmill farm electrical line, there was a telephone line, and then the Tesoro pipeline came and marked their pipeline. And when they came and marked it, their gentleman called me and met me in person at the pipeline because he had specific requirements. And so he marks the line, and then we start talking about what we want to do. And he says, well, if you want to put that pipeline, that water line here, you have to be at least 3 or 4 feet, and I don't quote me on the numbers, it's been a while, but he said you got to be well below the pipe, and everything that you dig has to be hand dug like 8 to 10 or 12 feet on either side of that pipe, because they were worried that, you know, you get a contractor and he hits the pipe and causes a problem. So I relayed that to our contractor, and he said, well, that $6,000 price is now going to be about $20,000 because of that hand digging. At which point my mom said, no, we can't afford that. So that was just, you know, something that my grandfather, who allowed that pipeline to be put in the 50s for $1 a foot, never foresaw that we would be encumbered by that in the future.
So let me jump in there. And these are analogies of your personal experience and basically explaining that regardless of how wonderful things might seem in Summit's presentation now, you have living proof where once projects are approved and constructed, all those promises kind of fall by the wayside.
Correct. And I'd like to continue on. I have more experiences. If you go to photo 3 or page 3, I don't know, it's maybe been 20 years. I don't know, it's been a long time. Our neighbor asked that when the rural water system would be put in, he wanted a pasture tap. And my father agreed to allow that to happen for them to cross our property. And if you look at number 3, you can see the pile of rocks that they brought up when they put it in, and they just left it on our property. If you go to the next page, page 4, if you look real closely down the middle of the picture, you can see the line where the pipeline was dug in. And the grass there has never been the same. Whatever they reseeded it with is a different texture and quality than the original native prairie. And it's just been permanently altered. And if you go to photo 5, you can see where the grass that they reseeded didn't take hold, and now it's just exposed earth, which it wasn't like that before they dug the line in. And the last one I want to talk about as far as existing utilities on our property is the power lines, one of the power lines. I believe in 2017, they sent a heavy construction crew in to raise the line. So they cut the wooden pole off and they raised it up, and then they used these metal clamp devices to permanently hold it in that upper position. And if you look at that picture, I have substantial concern that has a lot of lean to it. And I really wonder if someday that will cascade over. And the next page, 7, is a little closer view of it to try to highlight how it is leaning. And you can see that metal bracket. If you go to page 8, this is my primary concern with that power line and that activity. When they constructed or reconstructed those poles, they came in with a bulldozer and they pushed a path nowhere near the power line. But to gain the various locations of the power line, they use this bulldozer to push a path through that their other heavy equipment, the cranes and whatever they use to proceed. And this was what we were left with, and it continues to erode. You can see how the earth was just left raw, open, cut like that. If you go to section or page 9, here's another one that goes down a rather steep hill. This is what we were left with. Go to page or photo 10. Here you can see that at least they were somewhat under the power line, but again, pretty substantial erosion and ruts there from that. 11's another view of it. 12, you can see the delta that's formed at the base of the hill where the earth is eroded down. And you can just barely make out at the bottom of that picture a wooden structure that they used to cross the water, the low valley water area there. The next picture, 13, you can see it again, that structure that was left behind. It's a wooden structure that evidently they could drive their machinery over that somewhat floated. And it's somewhat, you can see that it's decaying. And so then I took a closer shot on number 14 of what's been left behind. And in addition to that power line, every so often they're driving a UTV through to inspect it, which may or may not cause distress to our cattle. They're coming through and doing tree trimming on a regular basis. And again, they use that same path, and it's extra wear and tear on that soil that's unprotected. And I find garbage left behind up there that when I go up and I ride around to enjoy the beauty and to look at our cattle, there's garbage. There's been gloves and food wrappers and pieces of hose or things that broke off of their equipment just laying there. And I'm going to conclude that area with just from what I've observed or heard or witnessed with Summit's behavior, their lack of communication with us and others, their tactics to basically hide behind attorneys, a team of attorneys to force this through. Other things that I've heard in the news about them, that I really expect that they're not going to treat our land any better than these other companies. I actually expect it'll probably be worse.
Okay, John, I appreciate that, and we will get those photos as an exhibit. Did you make it through, or where would you like to transition to next?
The next one I would like to transition to is the lack of actual communication they've had with us. And that's why I brought this stack of letters. I received these letters from Summit over time. And that's it. No calls, no in-person visits. And when I receive these, I feel no obligation to respond to this. This is just as if it's junk mail. I don't respond to every piece of junk mail I receive. By contrast, and these letters, they all say they all had my name on it, my wife's name, or I believe my wife's name, my father and my mother's name with another address, and my sister and her husband with another address. And yet they didn't receive the bulk of these. And I brought what my dad received from them. And as far as I know, he got 2. I suspect, being I have an out-of-state address, they approached me with the letters. Out of state, you're not close to the land, you're not probably going to be worried about the pipeline and its dangers, is all I can surmise. Pure conjecture on my part. And again, no other communication from them, nothing in person. Like my sister said, the only communication I received in person was when a summons server finally tracked us down. And that was where I happened to be standing with my dad, and the summons was delivered to my dad. And even though I was standing right next to him and the summons server said, or my dad said, well, this is my son and he's part of this. They couldn't find me because they were looking for me down in Minnesota. And it took them quite a while to get a hold of us down there.
John, but before you move on, I just wanted to make sure on your photo of your photos on page 14, it looks like kind of like almost a makeshift bridge with some ties there, some timber. What was the purpose of that, and why is it in disrepair? What's the reason you want the commission to understand that photo?
Well, to explain that structure, it was a floating raft mat for heavy equipment our land has lots of water areas that are just low. At the bottom of the hills and the valleys, there's just water that oozes out of the ground all the time, and it's just constantly wet and very soft. There's no way you could drive a vehicle across it. So they've drug these in to provide that floating mat type structure to drive over. And there's a handful of these that have been left up there. I can't tell you the exact number off the top of my head right now, but there are others. And yeah, they were heavy timbers tied together with steel rods and laid on the wet ground.
And to tie this back to Summit, John, and potentially affecting 4/4 or more of your land, are you expressing to the commission the challenges of the geography and the physical makeup, the hydrology of your land that makes it more difficult, and you believe you will be more significantly impacted should this project be approved?
Yes, and I've put these in here specifically to highlight our personal experiences with utilities and how they treat our land and treat us. But I will get into greater detail on the specific property that they want to put their pipeline through to address more of those kind of issues in the short near term.
Okay. And just to help you along, John, I don't know if you're going to continue to page 15, that Farmers Union Insurance. That is an exhibit. That document has already made it into evidence. Did you have any just brief comments related to your particular property concerns about that?
Yes. I don't want to jump off of my communication concept with Summit yet, but the Farmers Union Insurance letter is next on the list, and yeah, I can express that. I surmise that would have already been submitted from others, but I included it here just in case. But it does present us with substantial concern of the liability associated with this pipeline, because if you read in there, they say that they're excluding this pollutant from our policy. It presents a substantial exposure to you from a liability perspective and at a substantial elevated risk of uninsured exposure. If something happens, it's my understanding we'll be wiped clean. You know, we'll lose everything. I have no doubt about that. And the fight with attorneys and whatever proceedings happen, I have no doubt about that based off that letter.
Okay. Now, I'm sorry if I took you off your flow. If you want to continue with the communication piece.
Well, yeah, I would like to go back to the communication aspect just a little bit more here, because while these survey people were crawling around our neighborhoods, or our neighborhood, another neighbor straight to the north of us, basically, or property straight to the north and slightly to the east from our homestead, had allowed access. And I saw this entourage. It's several vehicles, lots of people, and they get out and they start to proceed eastward, which is in the direction towards our piece of property that they want to run the pipeline over. So I buzzed up there and I told the gentleman that was supposedly in charge, I said, we haven't granted access for them onto our property. And the person said, oh, okay, I guess we won't go there. Well, then I said, well, I'm going to keep an eye on you just so you don't go over there. But I didn't. I just drove down to our farmyard and I was busy doing repairs on a piece of machinery. Later, when they finished up, they drove by where I was working and I saw a window roll down as he slowly went by. And one of the people, I couldn't identify who it was, but held up one finger out of the window at me as he drove by. So he gave me a very derogatory gesture that obviously expresses disapproval with my stance. And then my sister already brought it up that after lawsuit proceedings had happened, I was working on cutting an alfalfa field. And I saw this whole entourage of cars proceed past and turn up to the road where I thought, uh-oh, they're here to gain access to our property. They're gonna do theirs, try to get on there. So I got out of the tractor, hopped in the vehicle I had nearby, drove up there, and they were all just hopping out, ready to go over the fence and into our property. And I said, hey, wait a minute, guys. You can't go in there. We have not granted access. And the archaeologist that said he was in charge said, oh, no, we've got the paperwork, says we can. And he rifles through this little folder and he pulls out a document. I'm like, well, that's something for Emmons County or somewhere else. I'm like, unless you have a court order that says you can gain access to our property, you're not allowed to go on. And so it was very peaceful, amicable. I backed away. I called my father. He came down and joined me. And if you, it's a photo of mine here. If you go to photo 19, you can see my dad sitting in the pickup with me as we just sat there and watched these guys. And it took, I don't know, 2-3 hours that morning. And I was actually in personal conversation with Steven here, back and forth. And he had relayed to me that, oh, and just after I told this archaeologist that you're not allowed to go on there, and I'm sitting with my dad, not very long, a sheriff's deputy car drives by that Summit had called. And the sheriff, after the sheriff's deputy talks to those folks for a while, the two deputies, the deputy and his assistant, come over and talk to my dad and I, and he says, well, they've got paperwork that says they can access your land. And I'm like, no, they're showing you a piece of paperwork that's not relevant to us. And so he went back over and then and they talked for a while and he came back and he said, yeah, you're correct. They don't have paperwork for you. And this was in a time where Summit had already served these eminent domain proceeding papers. Judge Narum out of a district court somewhere else granted that, but they had inadvertently left us out of that filing. So we weren't included. And so I don't know, it took a few hours, state's attorneys, whatever were involved in the background, but finally they wandered off and didn't do their survey. And to my knowledge, they haven't been back, but I can't watch it 24/7 to make sure. Oh, somebody asked about APH Farms earlier. I was just gonna explain that. APH Farms is a name that I've dreamt up for my mom and dad when I was in high school, because my mom was just starting to do some computerized bookworking. And at the very top of the page, you were supposed to have some kind of header. So I came up with APH Farms, Arden and Patricia Hagrod Farms. All that is. There's nothing formal about it. It's just what we've nicknamed it. And the last thing I would say about this communication and Summit's behavior here is that I've tried to make arrangements for a public service hearing in Morton County earlier. And there was some form that someone sent around and said, if you could get 5 signatures, you could get a public hearing added to the schedule. And so I reached out to every neighbor that I could find in Morton County that was along the route. And I got like 3 of them to agree to sign that paper. My dad being one of them. So I want to back up just a second here. Right now, we are in negotiations with the High Plains Connector power line. I don't know if you've heard of that one, if it's been brought up at all yet. The gentleman or that company has hired landmen. Those landmen have been just working the landowners up and down their proposed route. And they have been making accommodation after accommodation after accommodation on where to locate the power line. People that don't want it, they've been going around them. People that want it, they're accepting it. And so when you see their final work product, I haven't seen it personally, but my dad explained it to me from a meeting he went to. Their line zigs and zags and jogs. It is not a straight line. So I have no doubt if Summit weren't such introverts and would actually get out and talk to people, they could have found willing participants all the way through Morton County without any difficulty. But instead they've decided, using maps in an office in Texas or wherever they're from, this is where we're going. From hell or high water, we're going there. And in our case, they're using eminent domain. I mean, they've started to gain survey access. And I have no doubt that is the next logical step once they decide that they're going to proceed further.
John, can I stop you there for a second? Are you about to get kind of to your land and maybe the aerials? And I have an exhibit, which is the letter we sent. I'd like to ask you about it. Are we getting close to that? Okay. You might have additional copies, John, that you brought, but there's a binder with tabs in front of you, and tab 37 should be a 37, and Steve can help you if not. And we can come back to your papers, but tab 37, I'll represent, John, that is a true and accurate copy of the letter we submitted to Summit when we hadn't been hearing from them. And I just want you to identify that and confirm if that's correct. It should be 3 pages.
Yes, could you restate your question for me? I was looking at this.
Yes, you bet. And what we're doing now, we're just laying foundation, which means we're just establishing what this document is. And then I'm going to ask that it be received into evidence. So is this the letter that in April 23rd, 2024, it's dated, was sent to Summit's council, and you had prepared pages 2 and 3, which are kind of least worst options, so to speak?
Yes, at your advice, I did prepare this. It goes against my better judgment. I do not want this on our property. But yes.
Right. And I want you to explain that, John. I just have to jump in there. So this shouldn't be taken like this is some compromise that you want to exist, but given the fact we hadn't heard from them at all, despite knowing that you've been opposed to this for, going on 2 years now, did you prepare this at my suggestion to at least maybe put something out there if the commission makes the unfortunate decision to approve this?
I'd agree with that.
All right. Now, again, I don't want to throw you off your flow, but I think for the commission, it's probably helpful for you as the expert of your land to maybe continue with challenges, challenges generally, and then challenges based on Summit's proposed route. And then maybe if you can get into, with the understanding you don't want this at all, of what led to your proposed reroute. Why would that make more sense in relation to your land features and your operation?
There's a lot of things to unpack in that. That reroute, I personally have major concerns with that pipeline running under our farm field, or any farm fields that we farm. We rent several. When we drive a semi truck loaded with grain over top of that, when they constructed windmills around us where this oil pipeline ran, which is 3 or 4 feet below the ground. They made them berm up and over that pipe to get an additional 3, 4, 5 feet over it to protect it from that truck traffic. And here I've got farm fields that were driving those heavy semis with grain in them or bales on them, the combines, the 4-wheel drive tractors, the heavy machinery, the farming equipment. It just concerns me. Having that soil disturbed by the pipeline construction and compacted by the traffic on either side of it for their installation, I think it's going to destroy the productivity of that farmland for I don't know how long. So yeah, if push comes to shove and they're going to bulldoze us under, I said, well, maybe we can go around that field and avoid some of the other issues that that property has. And I'll kind of try to go through that a little bit. That property my father acquired many years ago. He bought it. I asked him when he bought it. He can't remember. It's been a long time. It's got an old farmhouse on it that was adobe constructed, the sod, soil, bricks. And then at some point they added wood siding around it. It's got scattered debris all over that land. There's numerous garbage pits out there that are, some may be buried, some are just open. That was put there before us and we've added to over the years. There's abandoned wells where they dug wells to get drinking water that have been abandoned on that property. There's old barns and chicken coops and other buildings that are sitting there decaying. There's scattered farm equipment and other cars and around there. It's actually the site of an abandoned coal mine. There's all kinds of wetlands or wet areas. And where their original route goes through that field, it's right at the base of a hill. And at the base of that hill, there is a section of land in there that in any years that are not extremely dry, we can't farm it because the moisture, the water just oozes out of the ground. And I have concerns that that hill could slide someday. The hill at the west end of that field is very steep. That hill could slide someday. I could take you around our property and show you numerous hills that have slid over the years. My dad, when he was young, there was one hill that slid. That hill slid again when I was in high school. That hill continues to slide. That's a little north of this. We've got all kinds of other places in our farm, in our pasture land that have slid over the years. When it gets a little wet, it'll fall.
And John, are you referencing that in concern to where this pipeline is proposed or potentially?
Their proposed route, yes, it goes right near that wet spot and where the hill is steep on one side of it and steep that they got to climb right over. I'm not guaranteeing that this reroute doesn't go through wet spots either, because there's others there where the ground is just oozing with water. One thing that's really interesting out on the western edge of that pasture area, if you go to the west end of that field, there's that tall hill, and that tall hill that extends to the south for 2 miles maybe. And when I was a little boy and we were moving our cattle into that pasture after they had calved in the spring and we had worked them, I was in a pickup truck with my dad's uncle, my granduncle, who grew up in the original farmhouse and lived in the original farmhouse that my great-grandfather built. And he told me about how years ago when he was young, the old wagons and cars in the earliest days, to get around that really tall hill, they had various places that they would drive to make it through there as they would go from Mandan or wherever and head towards Center or beyond. And the other thing he told me back then is that the Native Americans used to camp out up on that hill, and how they would travel right down past their farmyard. And sometimes they'd wake up in the morning and find them in their house. So I have concerns that there'd be native artifacts there to be found. So yeah, I have just numerous concerns with that pipeline proceeding through this area from the environmental standpoint and from our personal safety standpoint.
So John, what I'm going to offer now exhibit 37, and then I'm going to have some more questions about that. Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Glutt, any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
No objection.
All right, 37 is received.
And then, John, you're a very good historian and got lots of facts. I just want to be real specific. If you can look at page 2 of 37, and you might have it in front of you, it's aerial map. And so there, this is showing a proposed line of summit, and then in the red is again your, kind of my arm twisting. You put that together as a potential. And then I think to make this more confusing for you, yesterday Summit provided yet a different route. And have you had a chance to look at their latest potential route?
I saw that briefly. I can't recall the specific details of it at this point. If somebody could produce it, I could certainly talk to it. But I had just finished with a very long day of trying to plant soybeans and get a tractor moved, and so
well, that's fine, and we can get to that, or perhaps Mr. Liable can pull it up on his screen, or maybe even Mr. Glutt might even have a color copy of that. But I want to kind of focus us on the particular land issues and features and struggles, and I think you've done a good job. But was there anything else particular that you haven't talked to in reference to page 2 of exhibit 37? And if you reference any, can you reference the field and kind of north, south, east, west, so we, we're making a record and we know what we're talking about here?
well, yeah, our property is section 10 and 11, and I thought that the eminent domain was the north half of that. I'm not 100% certain because there were so many papers that went back and forth regarding that. North is up on the page. The field that I have concern with has an MP 176 right on it. If you notice just south of MP 176, you can see the windmill tower. That windmill tower, they actually excavated down between 2 hills to set it in there. The hill that would be just to the northeast of that is the one that I would have a concern about sliding, where they position their pipe in that original. And if you go just to underneath 176, that's the wet spot that I'm describing that oozes on any wet year, any year that's got any moisture. If you proceed to the west end of that field, that's a very steep hill that runs up that they're going to have to go right up and over. And I have concern that after they rip the soil up and put it back down and try to reseed it, that hill will probably erode for perpetuity.
Got it. And then on page 3 of exhibit 37, was that a second potential least worst option? Would that supplant or replace page 2 if possible?
Well, the distinction between page 2 and page 3 is page 2, if you jump on, we have the west half of section 11. The east half of section 11 is was owned by my dad's cousin, who is now passed away and has been inherited by her husband. And we rent that land. And again, my fear of having to drive over these fields with that pipe under it, I marked that up such that the pipe would go around the north end of the field on the land that we rent, my dad's cousin's land, my great-grandfather's original homesteaded land. So if you go to page 3, it's almost the same layout on our property, other than I brought it back down on the right-hand corner where they originally proposed.
And John, to understand page 3, there are you suggesting that your reroute on page 2, as found in section 12 and the western portion of section 11, that there would be no route on those parcels, those eastern parcels there?
No reroute.
Okay, got it. All right, now I'm to make this more confusing with all these maps, I'm gonna ask Mr. Liable to show you the summit map from yesterday afternoon. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but we just got this. And I believe this will become an exhibit later in the day, or maybe it's being filed, I don't know. But take a moment to kind of soak that in, and then talk through if you think that alleviates the soil, the hydrology, the slope, the terrain, the other type of easements and utilities, does that resolve those concerns on a least worst option, or are they still present?
They are still present, just different locations, but similar. This reroute, or this image here, is very similar to our page 3.
We need to know which document we're talking about specifically.
Yeah, yeah, so it's attached to the email that I think it was Mr. Glett sent yesterday. It's page 14 of the Bassan's new rebuttal testimony. So I'm certainly not going to offer his rebuttal testimony, but if you want to reference page 14, and then we can have this marked as a separate exhibit, just this page, and get that circulated.
Thank you.
Yep. So page 14 of the rebuttal of Mr. Bassan's. So Mr. Hagerott, just continue. So the same concerns that you've discussed are still present then?
Yes, and there are still water areas, potential water areas that they have to cross in this. They're now closer to all the debris that's scattered on that property. They're adjacent to a hill that's very steep on that reroute. And I believe they may be crossing the same areas that had these historic wagon trails, roadways, and the Native American campground areas. And then, there is some disagreement within our own family members, whether it's better to destroy the ground under a farmland or where the grass is for the cattle. So it's a no-win situation for us, no matter where you put it.
Now, I again kind of begged you to come up with a potential reroute, and we're looking at a variation of that here. But I mean, what you're looking for is this to avoid your property based on all the concerns and the historic and cultural resources, et cetera. Is that right?
That's correct. I would reiterate, if Summit would have actually used landman to navigate this path, I think they would have found 100% success in Morton County.
And do you believe that there are infinite numbers of other potential paths and zigs and zags that Summit could do right now today to move this off of the Hagerott land?
Yes, the obvious choice here would be to move farther north of Bismarck and that whole area and run straight west towards center. It would avoid all of this that they're fighting right now with their attorneys.
All right. I don't want to cut you short, but anything else that you think is important relative to the land itself, challenges, that negative economic impacts, the prohibition against development, just the headache, those kind of things that you haven't shared?
All the above. Yes, the taking of our property is another massive concern of ours. I see no benefit to our family or our heirs in any of this, and it's exposing us and our heirs, or whoever owns this in the future for a 99-year lease or easement, for what in their letter was a very small monetary offer. They gave us in their, I believe this was the first offer they sent in an email or a letter to me, was they were going to pay us $2.62 a foot.
I'm going to object, Your Honor. We're talking about easement offers and private easement negotiations. This isn't relevant to the commission's decision.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection, Mr. Hagerott. The Public Service Commission doesn't have any jurisdiction over contract negotiations or the eminent domain aspect of this project.
So let me ask it to you this way, without getting into the exact dollar figures. Based on the route that's being analyzed by the PSC and proposed, you do not have any confidence that for all the challenges to your land that you will be economically compensated such to justify this route on your property. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And
I just wanted to highlight in 1950-ish, my grandfather was given $1 a foot. So this number that they put on this form, I won't say the number, was ludicrously low. When I run the math and from what I've heard in news and publications that they're going to push 18 million tons of this CO2 through this 24-inch pipe on our land a year. And if you take that $85 tax credit per ton and you divide that by the number of miles in their pipe or their pipeline system, I came up with a number of 700,000 something. Maybe I'm off by some rounding there. It could be 500 to 800,000. I didn't do any specific, close, detailed calculation, but for them to give this substantially low offer when they're going to generate that kind of money in an annual basis from tax payments, it's laughable.
So before we get off of Exhibit 37, you I think talked about some homes and your sister did as well, and I failed to kind of pinpoint or get an approximate distance from any of the inhabited structures or structures that could be inhabited or places where you're often working. Can you help us out with some estimations of distances there?
Sure. Yeah, in on that map, from the closest point to our farmstead, which is just off the edge of the left edge of that photo or that map, is where our original farmstead is. And I would approximate that is a little over a half a mile, somewhere between a half a mile, 5/8 of a mile. We have good neighbors.
Let me just stop you there. Are we in which section are we in?
That's section 10.
Section 10.
And yeah, and our farmyard is on the very east edge of section 9, just immediately to the west of us. It's
Okay.
immediately west and slightly south is where our farmyard, and my sister lives adjacent to the original farmhouse that my dad's father developed.
And the estimation of distances again to those residences.
Yeah, I don't have a scale here, but I would say it's roughly a little over a half a mile. Half a mile, 3/4 of a mile, somewhere in there.
Okay.
And if you go over into section 2, you can see a farmyard there or a residence. That is one of our neighbors, the cops. They are, I don't know, just a smidge over a half a mile away. And their son lives a half a mile north of them. And I have a real concern for that family that lives just this slight distance to the north. The way that land forms, it slopes from where this pipe is, it sort of slopes downward and forms almost a bowl in that area. And so if this CO2 ruptures anywhere in proximity to that, I think, just my understanding of how CO2 is heavier than air, it could flow that way and impact them seriously. And on that same vein, if you go approximately 4 miles east of where our farmyard is, it was my page 16. This is approximately 4 miles east of us, if I recall correctly. There's a real young family that lives there.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. He's now talked about the cop's property, and now we're moving even further east, and he's testifying to others' property. If we can keep this focused on Mr. Hager's property, I think that we can move things along.
Well,
I think it's appropriate. Mr. Jordy, can you have Mr. Hagerot focus on the property he owns?
well, I can. I guess I would like to clarify that and leave it here. But bottom line, you're concerned about essentially the voiceless that aren't on the path, but are near to the path that aren't confronted with an easement and may not have those type of contractual language. Is that right?
Well, if I understand correctly, the PSC is trying to ascertain the welfare of North Dakotans with this proceeding. And here's a property where this homeowner has a small little subdivision lot that's completely surrounded by a landowner that lives in Grand Forks, North Dakota, that agreed to this easement, allegedly. And I just have a fear for their safety if something happens.
Understood. All right. And then if we continue to move on, then anything particularly else about the land in question that you want to share?
Yeah, I'll reiterate that there is just no guarantee that this pipe will not burst on our property. And if it does, it would present substantial risk to our health and our neighbors and our cattle and our neighbors' cattle. And along with that, I mean, in the bigger picture of this, I have a real concern with terrorism associated with this. It's obvious Summit knows that this line is dangerous, being they don't want to release their plume study. And under the guise of terrorism. And I picture this as a greenwashing project if there's ever been one. Taking these companies in Iowa and somehow or another throwing tax dollars at them to make their issue go away. I see domestic terrorism being a substantial risk with all the people that are anti-taxation, anti-liberal, anti-climate change. I mean, I can easily envision somebody getting, the road will be well marked. It'll have to be. Grabbing a shovel, digging a hole, dropping a bag of charcoal briquettes in there and a little lighter fluid and heating that up. Your steel gets a little warm. You get 300, 600 degree steel and it just turns into goo.
So let me stop you there for a second. So you understand that Summit has prevented us for a couple of years now from obtaining any dispersion modeling, dispersion analysis in North Dakota under the guise of terrorism. But your concern is if it's that dangerous, why are they even considering it?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I mean, I can envision pure chaos occurring in the denser residential areas. Prime opportunity for chaos to be created. You could make this thing rupture.
Now, John, I'm gonna see if, I don't know if Mr. Liebel's been able to get the, your photos marked, but our next exhibit would be 55. And I would like to offer those 22 pages of your photos from the blue folder as exhibit 55.
Any objection, Mr. Glad?
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Pelham?
So just to be clear, these are all of the, all pages in the blue folder, or just the first 22 pages?
I have yet to talk about the remaining pages.
That's why I'm asking, Mr. Doherty. I'm not sure what's being admitted or being proposed.
That's a great question. I've got 22 pages of documents that is our exhibit 55 that I understood was the contents of the blue folder, and so I'm offering all of those contents, all 22 pages.
Bulk of it is the photos, but there's some letters. There's an obituary appears.
The last pages are all tied together in my final piece of testimony.
I just want to be clear what it is we're actually admitting here.
Yeah, it's exhibit 55. Everything that is in there, which are everything in that blue folder, is exhibit 55.
I don't have any objection. Thank you.
All right, exhibit 55 will be admitted. I don't have a copy of it. I'm gonna need a copy of 55 for the official records, so.
Yep, my crack team there is working
Okay.
on that. Yep,
And I'll just ask Mr. Jordy, do you have a lot more questions for Mr. Hagerot? Because I'm thinking we should take our morning break. It's getting close to 11 o'clock, so.
why don't we break, and then we can kind of tighten this up and put a bow on his testimony here when we get back.
All right, let's take our morning break. Let's reconvene at 11:05.